Welcome to this week's episode of the Real Wealth Podcast. I'm Alex Robertson, and in this episode we're going to be talking about one of the biggest pieces of news out there right now. I am, of course, talking about the US election and the fact that Donald Trump has become the first ever convicted criminal to win the White House. And not only that, he's also the oldest at the age of 78. So massive drama in the US election, and to be honest, whatever way you go with this election, it has been, and no one can deny it's been very dramatic to watch. Now, I have to be honest, I've never been a big one to talk about politics. It's not something that I consider myself to be an expert on. So I have tended to shy away from those political discussions. But what I am very interested in is anything that affects the economy and anything that has a big impact on the taxation system. So obviously a few weeks ago we talked about the UK budget, their first budget under the Labour government, and the impact that was likely to have for business. It's very clear in the UK now that we have a government that is very much focused on the working person. They view anybody that has assets as non-working people, and that is not going to be good for us as entrepreneurs and those trying to build businesses. That being said, we would have thought the Conservative government were going to be better for business. If you go back 5-10 years, they were talking about reducing corporation tax from 20% down to 17% over a period of time. They'd done a complete 180 on that and increased corporation tax to 25%. So, it seems to be whatever way we turn in the UK government, we're not going to have a great ride as business owners, which is why a lot of millionaires have left the UK. It's doubled every year since COVID. You can see why a lot of people are abandoning ship. So really my interest in the US election comes back to what are the likely impacts for the UK economy, and for those of us who are trying to build businesses and build wealth within the UK, what is that likely to mean? So first of all, the biggest controversy around Trump's win is the fact that yes, he's a convicted criminal. Now it's important to distinguish between the two levels of criminality that he's accused with. So you have the state case, the hush money case that he's already been convicted of. So that is not an ongoing trial. He's already been convicted as a criminal. All that's to happen with that case is that it's awaiting sentencing, and sentencing is due, I think, on the 26th of November this month. So we're going to see what the judge decides to do in that case. Now, there is a clear distinction between federal charges and state charges. The hush money case is a state, it's a New York City state charge. And even presidents-elect, they have less control over getting out of state criminal convictions versus federal. So the federal case against them for messing with the election last time round is likely to be wound down now and will just simply go away over the period of the next few months. The criminal charges that have already been placed upon him in the state case in New York, we still need to see what's going to happen with that in November. Most legal specialists are saying that it's very unlikely that he's going to be sentenced to any jail time. It's probably most likely that any sentencing is going to be deferred because they're not going to want to mess with the governing of the US. So again, it's sort of expected that will go away, albeit under very different circumstances to the federal charges that are against them. So, nobody can argue that this US election has not been one of the most dramatic and entertaining political events in quite some time, from assassination attempts on Trump to the billionaire influencers to the fact that now we've got podcasts playing a massive part in these elections, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, to Kamala Harris saying at stages that a vote for Trump was essentially a vote against democracy, and bringing in Trump would essentially lead to a situation where we've got this autocratic leader in the US White House. So there's been a huge amount of drama, very convincing win for Trump, and not only did he win, he has significant control and control over the Senate, which means he's going to find his route to pushing through legislation much easier than it is for a lot of presidential leaders. So that brings us then to what are Trump's key policies, and what, more specifically, what key policies are likely to affect us in the UK. Now, he's talked about sweeping tariffs, he's talked about end to the war in the Middle East, he's talked about massively driving government efficiency, getting rid of the Department of Education, mass deportations of immigrants, fewer protections for let's try it again, LGBTQ community. There are a lot of different things he's talking about, and we do have to go back to the fact that in Trump's last tenure as president, he only implemented about 50% of the policies that he ran on. So it's very clear that whilst there's a lot of sensationalisation of the potential that can happen when a new presidential campaign, when a new presidential candidate is in the White House, the likely extreme outcomes that a lot of people talk about generally don't happen, because there is a process of running government. It takes a long time. It's really hard to make things happen, and I think we do have to take a bit of a sensible approach when we're trying to understand how big an impact these changes are. But that being said, the US is one of the biggest economies in the world. It is one of the biggest, I think it's the biggest single export destination for the UK is the United States. It has a huge economic impact, and let's not forget the US dollar is still the reserve currency of the world. So when the classic saying is, when the US catches a cold, the rest of the world feels it. So we are going to see some big impacts, and I think the biggest of which is likely to be the tariffs. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Before I get into that, I was really interested through this presidential election just how much of an impact podcasts had in this election, because it's the first time that candidates have really got involved in that scene. Podcasts are growing massively throughout the world. It is one of the few mediums that can still engage people for a longer period of time. You look at a lot of social media engagement, and effectively you're talking about 30-second reels, 60-second reels. It's hard to capture people's attention for any period of time now. You've got a whole new generation of kids that really don't watch television. They'll watch YouTube, they'll watch things on their phone, they'll watch social media reels. They like to get to the kind of point much quicker. They're not happy to watch long drawn out documentaries. It's becoming harder and harder to engage with some of the younger generations, and podcast seems to be a medium that can still do that, and it can do it in long form content. So being able to get long form content out there to a lot of people is one of the challenges for any new politician trying to come in and run their campaign. And I have to say, I was blown away with the numbers that Trump got on the Joe Rogan show. So that was one of the biggest things, that a presidential candidate was on the Joe Rogan podcast. He was sitting there for 3 hours in a really in-depth interview, and that podcast reached 50 million people. And that's while it's still claimed that the circulation of that podcast was being manipulated through the algorithms of social media. He still managed to get 50 million views. So you imagine the effect of that, even when they're doing these road shows, when they're on the road and they're going from state to state to deliver an address. They can't reach anywhere near that number of people. So to be able to get that level of exposure, I think, was huge for Trump. And for him to go into the level of depth that he did with Joe Rogan, the level of diverse conversation that they had, that must have played a big part in Trump ultimately gaining that victory. Kamala Harris had a similar attempt going on the Call Her Daddy show, but less than 1 million people viewed that podcast, which is still big exposure, but nothing like what Trump received on the Joe Rogan podcast. So that's really interesting. I think we're now in the last few years of seeing political campaigns run the way they have historically. I think there's going to be a massive shake-up in how things are run going forward. It's getting harder and harder with social media and artificial intelligence to understand what's real out there, and how that's managed is going to be a big challenge. To make sure that these races are democratic and fair. So we're going to have some big challenges there. You know, podcasts have huge influence. You know, we've got massive influencers out there. You know, we've seen Elon Musk supporting Trump, and that has to have had a huge effect, especially when you consider that Elon Musk is one of the key owners of one of these social media platforms, and X. It's just all very interesting. It's been a really interesting race, and I do think we're on the precipice of a massive turning point of how these political races are going to be run, and the mediums under which the campaigns are run. So very interesting. Obviously for Trump it was hugely important that he won, you know, facing criminal convictions, federal charges. There is the thought that this guy was either going to be in the White House or in jail, so you know, a massively important race for him to win, and he came out victorious. So how is that likely to impact the UK? The biggest, I guess, and most concerning point of all of Trump's policies is sweeping tariffs. And I actually heard him on the Joe Rogan podcast say his favourite word in the dictionary is the word tariff. You know, he feels massively passionate about the ability to strengthen the US economy through applying these tariffs to try and generate ultimately more manufacturing in the US, less importations, and really benefit from all the resources that the US have had. It's no secret that he had some, you know, major conflict with China over, you know, during his last presidency, and, you know, really trying to get away from all this manufactured Chinese stuff coming into the US. They want to bring back the wealth that they seen when tariffs were a big part of the US government, you know, well over 100 years ago. It was one of the times where the US government had massive wealth. So, you know, that is, you know, when we talk about the fact that he's not going to have time to implement all of these policies that he's talking about, I do feel that the tariff situation is going to be something that is a big focus for him. And some analysts have said that if he implements the tariffs in the way that he's talking about, we could see a drop of around 150 billion a year in exports to the US from Europe. Now, that's not the UK numbers. That is the broader numbers from Europe. However, some of those bigger tariffs that he's talking about are on imported vehicles. He doesn't want to see vehicles being imported into the US, and that is one of the largest exports that the UK has to the US is vehicles. You know, Jaguar Land Rover could be massively hurt through the move to put 100% tariffs on their vehicles. You know, that could be just the complete loss of the US market for that, which could mean jobs. It could be you know, a seriously tough time for that car manufacturer. The UK also exports to the US pharmaceuticals, medical goods, and even things like Scottish whisky. Scottish whisky is a big part of our economy here in Scotland. A lot of that is exported to the US. And if they start putting massive tariffs on that, again, we could see some significant issues with our economy. And keep it in mind that this is already in the context of a budget released by Labour a couple of weeks ago now, where growth is pretty flat already. You know, we're talking about between 1.2 to 1.7% annual GDP growth. It's already very low. We're already struggling to hit those growth numbers, and certainly when you take it in terms of per capita growth, it's not there. You know, per capita GDP is going to be down. Overall, we've got 1.7% of the absolute best case growth through this budget. The UK's fundamental issue, and I said this in the podcast we did a couple of weeks ago, is the Labour government's very much focused on growth being driven by infrastructure, by public sector spending. That to me is not the way to drive growth. It's through building businesses, entrepreneurship, incentivising people to go out there and create business that creates jobs and helps grow the economy. And that way, how can you put more money into the NHS and expect to see, you know, a massive surge in economic growth? It just doesn't add up to me. You know, they're talking about the high-speed train again, which has been an ongoing saga. It's almost become a bit of a joke. with the government that they think, again, this was one that Rory Sutherland talked a lot about, of like, why not make the journey more enjoyable and more productive than faster? So you get these high-speed trains, okay, you can get to London in half the time, that's great, but if you had good Wi-Fi and a comfortable environment to work in, you could be as productive in that situation than having to get there quicker. And again, it's just really tenuous to understand that these things could lead to real genuine growth when taxes are so ridiculously high. There's no incentive for anybody to start business in the UK. I think we're on a really difficult trajectory. Now, not only that, we have the potential of these tariffs in the US that's going to affect a lot of our exports over there. The other thing to consider is that whilst the US has got massive plans, Donald Trump's whole psychology around growing the economy of the US has been around reducing taxes, especially for businesses, and that is going to come with costs. Spoke about this a lot on the podcast before, the Laffer curve, when we're talking about taxes, and the idea that there's sort of a bell curve called the Laffer curve, which says there is an optimum amount of tax, an optimum percentage of tax that will allow your government to receive the absolute maximum tax revenues. And then when you start to increase the tax rate more, the curve will start to drop again, because people will start to leave, or they'll try and find ways to avoid tax in a more aggressive way. And ultimately your gross tax receipts start to go down as the rates get higher and higher. So it's the idea that there's this optimum level of tax. And Trump's whole perspective on this is, he was talking about dropping taxes to 20%. In some instances, when they're manufacturing in the US, dropping it as low as 15%. And his view is that whilst the tax rates are lower, they will encourage more economic growth and encourage more people to come to the US and pay taxes. And ultimately what he expects is higher overall gross revenues of tax, even although the tax rate is lower. It was a philosophy actually that Putin put in place when he first came into power in Russia, where there was a lot of people not paying taxes. Taxes were very high. You had all these ultra wealthy Russians who were just not paying tax. He reduced tax to 20%, but he also added criminal convictions for those that were not paying their taxes, and dealt with that in a very serious way. And ultimately Russia's tax revenues did go up. That's definitely not a plug for Putin, but it is one of the policies when he came in power that was effective. So that's Trump's view. The UK is so far from that view. It's unbelievable that the idea that they can just continue to increase taxes and just deny the fact that a huge amount of people are leaving the UK. A huge amount of businesses are leaving the UK because they just cannot sustain the level of tax. Whereas Trump's saying, nope, I'm going to reduce taxes. I'm going to encourage everybody to manufacture in the US. And ultimately that's a big bet. He believes it's going to work, but if it doesn't, then there is a big concern that is going to lead to a growing national debt within the US. And keep in mind that Trump's last tenure as president, the national debt in the US grew by $7.2 trillion. So his argument for that was it was COVID, that he said they were on track to start reducing the national debt. He had all the policies in place, things were running well, then COVID happened and basically scuppered his plans. But the concern for us in the UK is that if these policies that he puts in place to try and grow the US economy, if they don't work, they are very expensive tests. So dropping taxes, for example, if it doesn't work, it could cost them a huge amount of money. The deficit could increase massively. And as we said before, any issue for the US ends up becoming an issue for the UK. And the concern with a lot of people out there is that we in the UK are going to see interest rates higher for longer because of potential economic challenges in the US. On the flip side though, if the US and a lot of this stuff that Trump's talking about works and things start to improve, then we could see a situation where things get better in terms of interest rates overall in the UK. But my overall view of the economic position for the UK based on Trump's presidency is that the tariffs are likely to be coming, and they are going to hit us hard. So that is something to be concerned about. Certainly in terms of how low our growth forecasts already are for the UK. So it could be a tough time coming. I guess more widely, we talked about crypto before in the podcast. We've had Don and Dec from Crypto Glasgow, and I think Don messaged me Dec messaged me the other day and said, so when we done the interview, Bitcoin was at $30,000, and fast forward to where we are now, certainly post Trump election, it's at over 90,000. So it's basically tripled in price from when Dec and I had that podcast end of last year. Massive move, and he was like, please tell me you're involved now in Bitcoin. And the honest answer is I'm not, but only because of the level of activity we've got going on at Real Property Scotland. We've just done this massive acquisition in Aberdeen, 7 million acquisition on property that's worth 12 million. So we are still ploughing capital into the property market, and we're seeing some massive opportunities there. So it's hard to kind of start carving out capital to say, okay, well, we're going to do a bit of Bitcoin in the background. But for anybody that did get on board at the time of that podcast, wow, there's been some incredible returns on that. And ultimately the 30% increase we've seen in Bitcoin since Trump was elected comes back to the fact that there's an expectation that he is going to be very favourable for cryptocurrencies. If you go back a few years, Trump's position was, no, the US dollar is king and will always be. His position has changed quite dramatically on that to, his involvement in some crypto coins. His latest statements really are around the fact that if crypto is going to be the way forward, then he wants to make sure that the US is at the precipice of that. So, the expectation that Trump is going to be very favourable has massively impacted already the cryptocurrency market. I think, the only other thing I wanted to briefly mention, another big thing that Trump's been talking about is the war in the Middle East. And he's asserted that he's going to stop all of the conflict that's going on in the Middle East. Where the impact of that for the UK economy, well, it's not so straightforward. The UK's just pledged another couple of billion, I think, to the Ukraine war. So we are spending a huge amount of money on the conflicts in the Middle East, but it's money that we're spending based on the expectation that if Russia is able to advance, if the other interests in the Middle East are not managed, then it could affect us in the longer term, and certainly it is to a level of fight on democracy. So there's a lot of concerns. A lot of people are worried about what is Trump had a close relationship with Putin. He fostered a relationship in South Korea as well. Question becomes, what is the cost of this if he does end the war or the conflicts in the Middle East? What is the cost? And my view is, honestly, in the short term, I don't think this is going to be high on Trump's agenda. I think he's much more set on tariffs. He's got a huge amount of appointments to make in the US. He's still got a lot to deal with in terms of winding down these criminal convictions, that criminal conviction and the federal case against him. He's gonna have his hands tied up pretty heavily, so I don't think that's going to be a big focus for him in the short term. I don't expect much to happen there. One thing I do like about the Trump administration is the drive for efficiency, and the more I've heard from the Labour government in the UK about expanding public sector spending, the more it worries me, because I feel like it's so massively inefficient. I've seen firsthand what goes on in the NHS, and the amount of departments they have within the NHS that are just ploughing through money to no benefit overall. Since COVID, the NHS really hasn't recovered. Most people can't get an appointment. People are dying because they're not getting diagnosed quickly enough. It's a shambles, and to throw money into a broken system is really concerning. Whereas Trump's approach is to have this governmental efficiency department, which is going to be sweeping through all these government agencies. And I heard Elon Musk talking about the fact that there's 425 government agencies in the US. He reckons that should be 99. He reckons he could get it down to 99. And obviously Trump has put him in that position to do that. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they, look at efficiency across all these government bodies, and how they take almost a business view to what has been an overinflated public sector. A lot of the things that Trump's planning for the US would be really inspiring for the UK. It's and again I have to qualify this. My focus is economic, and its tax system, and it's being able to build wealth and create generational wealth over a period of time. Everything comes with a downside, and the downsides of Trump are very serious. I don't think the human rights element of what's going to be going on in the US is going to be particularly pretty to watch. I am talking about things almost entirely on the economic front, and I think in terms of pushing to drive government efficiency, that would be massively powerful in the UK. It's never going to happen under a Labour government, and that's the biggest challenge. If we had a party in the UK that was going to bring in some sense of business proprietary, some sense of true economic understanding rather than the pretense of economic understanding through political agenda, I think it could be massively powerful for what could be achieved in the UK, but we're miles away from it. So, in terms of America, if I was an American, I'd be quite excited about, the economic potential of having someone like Trump in the White House, and certainly some of the advisors he's bringing in. There could be a lot of potential there. So I'm going to summarise things now, but I'm not a political expert. I am commenting on this really purely from the economic and tax side of things, and looking more specifically about how it's going to impact the UK. It's a very interesting time across the world right now. Unfortunately, a lot of the benefits the Americans are going to see from having a Trump presidency, and the benefits economically that could lead to are going to be at the cost of other countries, specifically the UK. We are a big exporter to the US, and tariffs are almost a certainty. From what I've heard from Trump talking, I think that's going to be the kind of first thing, if not second thing on his agenda. So it is going to impact us negatively. We are going to see potential drops in our GDP forecasts as a result of it. I think that's really the main takeaway for me. So that's it for this week. Brief overview of Donald Trump and our new criminally convicted president in the White House. Thanks for joining us on this wealth journey. I've been Alex Robertson, and this has been the Real Wealth Podcast.